Wharton's presentation of marriage in the House of Mirth is consistently bleak. It is an artificial construct which entraps and brings indifference, boredom and misery. The irony, however, is that for the majority of members of society presented in the novel, entering into a marriage would have been a fait accompli. It was something you simply had to do, whether you were a man or a woman, although the motivating factors for both sexes would have been different. Hence, when the novel ends with the tragic, unmarried heroine Lily Bart's death in a shabby, soulless boarding house, in many ways this was inevitable. The logical consequence for someone who wanted to remain within fashionable society, yet failed to play by its rules, including the idea that women must marry within their 20s in order to survive. The House of Mirth contains virtually no positive descriptions of married life, both envisaged by Lily and in practice. Most married couples at best tolerate or are indifferent to each other, or at worst are contemptuous and participate in determined unfaithfulness. Early on in the novel, the narrator describes the relationship between Lily's parents. Mrs. Hudson Bart is presented as someone without any feelings or empathy whatsoever for her husband. When the latter unexpectedly turns up for luncheon on a Saturday, the indifference of wife and daughter is highlighted when the narrator observes, but neither his wife or his daughter was sufficiently interested to ask an explanation. The implication is that communication between husband and wife may be confined to the purely functional. There is no phatic talk or attempt to show or feign interest in the husband provider. This indifference between married couples is seen throughout the novel. Judy Trenner thanks Lily for putting up with all her husband's tiresome stories and confides, "I know what they are because I had to listen to them when we were engaged." Whilst Mrs. Penniston sees her husband's death as a remote event, which appeared to dwell in her memory chiefly as a dividing point in the personal reminiscences that formed the staple of her conversation. Hence, when Lily envisages married life with Percy Gryce, the representation of other married couples in the novel suggests she is likely to be right to imagine him boring her for life. However, the representation of marriage in the novel is so bleak that actually those married couples who get by simply tolerating or ignoring each other may be the lucky ones. Indifference and vague dislike is only possible when social and financial positions are secure. Thus, when Lily's father fails to continue to fund his family's social position and lifestyle, he becomes an object to be venomously scorned and resented. Following his financial ruin, he embarks upon a slow and difficult dying. To his wife, he no longer counted. He had become extinct when he ceased to fulfill his purpose, and she sat at his side with the provisional air of a traveller who waits for a belated train to start. As ever, Wharton's language is precise and unsparing. The adjective extinct, generally used to describe entire species who no longer exist after failing to adapt to altered environments, dehumanises the husband and suggests that he literally has only one reason for existence: provide for wife and family. If he cannot do this, he no longer metaphorically exists. This analysis strips married relationships down to the basest of functionalities and refutes either the possibility or even pretense of common interests or affection between the two people. This was arguably the case between Edith Wharton and her own husband. Henry James referred to Edith marrying Teddy as an almost, or rather an utterly inconceivable thing. Whilst R.R.B. Lewis, in his biography, suggests that there was neither a shared literary interest nor passion between them. The imagery of Mrs. Hudson Bart waiting for her husband to die is equally terrifying. Just as trains need to move to fulfill their purpose, so her husband needs to die, and as quickly as possible. None of us like to be kept waiting for public transport. Unfortunately, it's not possible to write off Mrs. Hudson Bart as an exception. You only need to look at the language used to describe Mrs. Wellington Bry's marriages or George Dorset's feelings about his marriage to appreciate that in the world of the House of Mirth, personal social advancement and the need for financial security will always trump traditional, illusory, romantic notions about marriage. Indeed, Gloria Ehrlich goes one step further when she writes that for Wharton, marriage and fidelity to the social code meant entrapment, not securing love, but foreclosing the possibility of it. Wharton's presentation of those who are married in the novel, the Dorsets, Lily's parents, and those who aren't, Selden and Lily, confirm it. Love within marriage is a virtual impossibility. Why is this? Why is love within marriage, or at least love as we as modern readers would define it, i.e. something involving a degree of companionship and affection, seemingly non-existent in the House of Mirth? A significant motivating factor is that, until relatively recent history, and including the beginning of the 20th century, within fashionable New York society, the only way a majority of women could achieve both social and financial security and/or prosperity was by marrying a wealthy man. An inevitable consequence of this, albeit perhaps an unwitting one, is that issues such as whether the man and women are compatible, have common interests, and even if they like each other beyond the sexual desire of the man, become largely irrelevant. As Pamela Knight references within the chapter entitled The Marriage Market, within Laura Rattray's edited Edith Wharton in Context, with women, marriage tends to become a form of purchase contract in which the woman barters her sex capital to the man in exchange for life support. Within such a transactional system, it is hardly surprising that women such as Mrs. Hudson Bart become so indignant. She has kept her side of the business arrangement of marriage, and so by God her husband should have done the same. Perhaps there is another reason why wives become more furious with husbands who fail as providers. They have to work so much harder during the courtship process. I've already referred to Judy Trenner's forced tolerance of her husband's stories during their courtship, but Lily Bart herself is all too aware of the kind of complex role-playing and wheeler-dealing required for women determined to find a husband who might ultimately decide to do her the honour of boring her for life. In chapter 4, she compares her own situation with her cousin Jack Stepney's and observes, "All Jack has to do to get everything he wants is keep quiet and let that girl marry him. Whereas I have to calculate and contrive and retreat and advance, as if I were going through an intricate dance, where one misstep would throw me hopelessly out of time. The bombardment of verbs, calculate, contrive, retreat and advance, in addition to the simile, emphasise just how manipulative and almost certainly lucky women have to be in order to engineer a situation in which the man is moved to propose marriage. For although marriage itself consists of a barely veiled business transaction between two parties, and in the case of Rosedale's marriage proposal to Lily, there is no veil at all, it can only be triggered by one of them, the man. And with the game of attracting a suitable husband being of such critical importance for women, the support of a mother who, remember, will have navigated the same perilous seas earlier is shown to be crucial. In Lily Bart's case, she is left vulnerable following the death of her mother, who, arguably, was left too raging and bitter following her own husband's failure to be of much help anyway. Nonetheless, she still sighed to think what her mother's fierce energies would have accomplished had they been coupled with Mrs. Peniston's resources. Without compelling and propelling maternal support behind her, the kind that resulted in Evie Van Osberg stepping in to pinch Percy Grice, Lily is able to get away with her fatal tendency to set up the groundwork for a prosperous marriage before blowing it at the last minute, which results directly in her social and mental decline and eventual death. And so, in the world of the House of Mirth, most married couples are shown at best to be either boring, Grice and Evie van Osburgh, Jack Stepney and Gwen van Osborg, or to bore each other, the Dorsets, the Trenners. At worst, feelings of hatred can develop between the couples, as seen in the failure of Carrie Fisher's marriages, Mrs. Hudson Bart's attitude towards her husband following his financial failure, or George Dorset towards Bertha following her successful manipulation of him so that they remain married in spite of her renowned philandering. To a significant extent, these unhappy and wholly unsatisfactory marriages are caused by an economic and social system in which women have virtually no other means of earning their living. Marriage has to be that means. There is so much riding for the fashionable woman on a successful marital conquest, and so prevented from making open declarations of her own through Austen-esque rules of propriety. It is no wonder that it is the women in the novel who are the master manipulators. The high-stakes games within courtship has trained them up perfectly. However, Wharton's presentation of marriage gets even bleaker. What I find as disturbing as the accepted indifference and contempt between husband and wife is the hypocrisy. Infidelity within marriage, provided the husband is not aware, indifferent, or even, God forbid, supportive, is placidly accepted within the novel, whereas an unmarried woman's reputation and place within society can potentially be ruined by any old rumour linking her with an act of impropriety, sexual or otherwise. This hypocrisy is summed up in Mrs. Trenner's breezy seating plan at Bellamont. The narrator reveals Riley, Mrs. Trenner, true to her simple principle of making her married friends happy, had placed Selden and Mrs. Dorset next to each other at dinner. But, in obedience to the time-honoured traditions of the matchmaker, she had separated Lily and Mr. Grice. The ironic tone is hilarious. The idea of Mrs. Trenner having a straightforward desire to make her married friends happy sounds considerate and innocent. However, the reality is that to achieve this, she is willfully facilitating the resumption of an affair. At this stage in the novel, the extramarital relationship between Mrs. Dorset and Selden has been ended by the latter, much to the dissatisfaction of the former, which emphatically would not make the cuckolded man happy. Mrs. Trenner's seating position sums up the hypocrisy and skewed value system of society as presented in the novel. Provided there is no public scandal or fuss from the man, a nice juicy affair is just fine. However, for those trying to get married, the woman in particular has to jump through an extraordinary number and range of hoops, and God help her if she is smeared by scandal. Thus, the married Bertha Dorset can get away with lustful, mildly if temporarily fulfilling sexual liaisons with Selden and Ned Silverton, whereas Lily's reputation and thus ability to attract a husband is hit much harder with far more minor indiscretions, including enlisted Trenner's help to speculate on the stock market and being seen leaving his house late in the evening. Indeed, affairs are so routine and unshocking in the world of the House of Mirth that they can be used to define the main work or employment purpose of a married person. Judy Trenner, referring to the fact that Bertha Dorset isn't currently having an affair, describes her matter-of-factly as being out of a job at present. It's interesting to note that Wharton's presentation of marriage in The House of Mirth, published 1905, is more bleak than her 1920 masterpiece, The Age of Innocence. The Age of Innocence is a novel about Newland Archer, engaged and then married to unimaginative but dutiful May Welland, but attracted to her more spontaneous, unconventional cousin, Eleanor Lesker. Crucially, the end of the novel suggests that Newland's rather staid, formulaic marriage to May did have value, did mean something, and that pursuing personal fulfilment at the cost of all else can clearly have damaging consequences.
However, you could also argue that a novel focusing on the married life of a male protagonist is always likely to be more positive than one such as House of Mirth, in which our heroine has to fight against the hypocrisy and bigotry of a patriarchal society. Perhaps the main problem with Lily Bart is that, although she probably never realised it, she never really wanted to get married in the first place. A subconscious desire which, in the immortal words of her mother, effectively left her extinct. This has been a Schofield on Shakespeare production, exploring the presentation of marriage in Edith Wharton's The House of Mirth. Many thanks for watching.